With this lecture, we're going to talk about Anova, which is kind of a complex version, a more complex version of a t-test. And I think the title is kind of misleading. It's just these are more advanced statistical procedures beyond correlation or t-test. As we talk about things like Anova, and then we've already discussed regression, for example. So the problem is if we run a lot of tests, right? I'm going to throw this on there, right? If we're running, say, 4, 5, 6 tests, what we're doing is essentially stacking a small margin of error on a small margin of error and so on and so forth. So our margin of error, our significance, as we've talked about through this course, is 0.05. But if we run, say, 4 tests with 0.05 as our margin of error or our significance, essentially what we have done now is inflated the chance that we're wrong, right? We're basically providing a lot of conclusions or a lot of statistical analyses where we were 95% confident. So that starts to actually add up for a fair margin of potential error. So what we do is what's referred to as a Bonferroni adjustment. And it's a very simple calculation where we say, okay, we want to make sure that the overall significance of the study is 0.05. And we will take that level and divide it by the number of tests that we're conducting, right? So if we're conducting, say, five statistical analyses, we do 0.05 divided by 5, and what that would do is give us an individual statistical significance of 0.01. That means each of our tests, each of our statistical analyses needs to have a significance of 0.01 in order for the entire study to have a significance of 0.05, right? Less than 0.05, as it were. Right. So what we're trying to do here is make sure that we are always having the minimum amount of doubt or error in our studies by doing the appropriate calculations. Or another option is the lower bullet point there indicates we can actually reduce the number of tests that we have to run, and that's where Anova comes in, right? So it's an acronym for analysis of variance. And what allows us to do is replace many t-tests with just a single Anova. Right? So as we talked about in the t-test lecture, t-test can only handle up to 2 separate groups. However, Anova allows us to do an analysis where there are more groups, right? So if I wanted to look at the difference in GPA between freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, what I would essentially have to do with t-tests is run a series of t-tests. Freshman to sophomore, freshman to junior, freshman to senior, sophomore to junior, sophomore to senior. And you see how they start to add up. All of them have 0.05 of a margin of error, right? And that starts to add up. What we can do instead is run one single analysis of variance. And what that allows us to do is say, okay, is there a significant difference, or more specifically, the term we would use is there a significant main effect of year in college on GPA? And so in a single ANOVA, it would allow me to compare the GPAs of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors simultaneously with only one test instead of the litany of tests that we would need, the litany of t-tests that we would need to do the same kind of analysis. So it's a really effective tool for examining multiple comparisons at the same time, and thereby not reducing the overall significance of our study. So when we run an ANOVA, it's going to give us what's referred to as an F statistic. Oops, sorry, let me go back. There we go. And it's essentially looking at the variance or the variability between groups and comparing that to the variability within groups, right? So let me walk you through this slowly. With freshmen, for example, if I was to take the GPA of 100 freshmen, we're going to see a certain amount of variability in those scores, right? Some freshmen will not do very well in their first year and have like a 1.2. Hopefully, many others will be above a 3.0, right? And so we're going to see a given amount of variability within that group. But what we're doing is we're essentially comparing the variability within the groups to the variability between the groups. So essentially, are we seeing more difference between, say, freshmen and sophomores than we do within the freshman group or within the sophomore group, right? That's what we're really assessing here. That's where the F-test comes in. And essentially what the F-test result indicates is if a higher level or a higher F-test result indicates a greater variability between the groups, right? A greater variability between the groups. And what that means is essentially we're seeing a main effect of the group you belong to. So the group you belong to seems to have a greater effect on your GPA than just being who you are, basically more than the individual effect, right? And so the insight gained here is, does it matter if you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior with regard to your GPA? And if the test is significant, if the F-test provides a high enough result, then the answer is yes, it does matter which year you are in with regard to your GPA. All right. But I hear you asking, oh faithful student, how high does it need to be? What is the threshold for an F-test? To that, I would answer, go. In this case, we're going to run this equation, and thank God, SPSS does all this for you. So if you think, oh my gosh, we're going to have to do really complex math for this lecture, absolutely not, because that's not why we're here. Essentially, what it's doing is it's taking the sum of squares within groups, as well as the degrees of freedom within groups, and calculating the mean square within groups, right? And you're thinking, oh my gosh, what the heck does that mean? Okay, don't worry, it gets better. Very much like Easter, right? There was a sad part, and then Christ is risen and redeemed. Well, he's risen and we're redeemed, right? Then we take that sum of squares between groups, and then we add the degrees of freedom between groups. We use all of it to calculate the mean square between groups. All of this comes together in a very fancy equation that leads to the F statistic, right? Thank God, when you're saying your prayers tonight, thank God that you don't actually have to do any of those calculations by hand. SPSS, our beloved statistical program, does all of that for you. And what it does is it calculates the F statistic. So basically, and I've got mean square between groups, mean square within groups. Basically, it's looking how much variability there is between groups and how much variability there is within groups, like we've just talked about. And it calculates that into a number. And the three things that come into it, as I said, degrees of freedom within groups, between groups, and then also the alpha level, which we almost always said is 0.05. Okay, essentially, what happens is SPSS will calculate a critical value. It'll say, okay, based on the degrees of freedom, the number of groups, and the alpha level you want, here's your critical value, right? It will also say, here is the F value that we achieved in the calculation, and it will tell you whether or not the F value exceeds the critical value or not. And that will tell you whether or not there's a significant main effect. I know that was really complicated and convoluted. If we looked at this in SPSS together, it would not nearly be that bad. In fact, I would invite you to look at my YouTube channel that talks about how to run an Anova, because it's actually really, really straightforward when you go to calculate an SPSS. But this is the infrastructure below it. This is what's going on. Essentially, it's telling you, look, is there a difference between the groups, or is most of the difference within the groups? And if the F value exceeds the critical value, then you can say, yeah, there is a significant main effect of these groups on the GPA or whatever the dependent variable is in your case. Okay, it's essentially doing the exact same thing that a t-test does, but now it's doing it for multiple groups or multiple conditions at the same time. That's what it boils down to. I know that seemed really convoluted. This is so much better of a lecture to teach face to face, because the last few slides get really, really confusing if you're just looking at them with me as I talk to you. But don't worry, it's okay. All right. We also talked about this previously. I'm just going to reiterate factorial designs. Okay? Factorial designs involve more than one independent variable, and it allows for examination of interactions between variables, right? So ANOVAs are very good for just a single variable, right? So you do what's called a one-way ANOVA. Very straightforward. So in this case, we might do year in school on GPA. So year in school is your independent variable, GPA is your dependent variable, right? But you could also do a factorial ANOVA that allows you to examine year in school and video game playing as it impacts GPA. Because what you might find is, okay, even if you're a senior, seniors tend to have higher GPAs than freshmen, for example. If you're a senior who plays a lot of video games, being a senior and playing video games is going to interact in a way that will probably lower your GPA, right? It allows us to examine multiple interactions, multiple independent variables at the same time. Right? And you might be wondering why that risque picture of Kim Kardashian on the bottom right. What I would argue is Kim Kardashian because that's just who she is? I would actually argue that it's a factorial design. There's an interaction effect going on here, right? She was born to a famous person, right? Is one factor. She happens to be very deeply engaged in the world of celebrity, which is another factor. Social media took off right around the same time that she, reached her, I don't know, her life and social media taking off kind of follow a correlative relationship, right? And people essentially pay her to be her. right? These are all interactive effects. I'm not saying that she's perfect or anything like that. It's far from, but she is who she is because of several factors. And I think when we go to judge people that are celebrities just for the sake of being celebrities, I think we have to consider, okay, well, why are they that way? Why did they become that way? This is actually a picture of her book, of her own selfies, right? Because she's known as like a selfie queen, right? The book is called Selfish because that's just clever wordplay, right? But why did she feel like the world needed a book of her selfies? For a variety of factors. It is a multi-way interaction. It is not just her being her, it is everything about her and everything about the world that have interacted in a way that made her think, yes, I'm going to publish this book. And in fact, she made a lot of money off of that book, right? This is the nature of how variables interact. And as I've said many times before, do not ever assume that there's a single independent variable that is impacting a dependent variable. It is almost, I'm not going to say almost always, it is always multiple variables impacting, multiple independent variables impacting a dependent variable. And as you go to do your analysis and design your thesis, and just think about life in general, always consider the fact that there are always moving parts impacting outcomes.